Hi everyone, I'm Lisa from Pink Hollybush Designs. Welcome to my sewing studio. I just finished sewing my first wool coat and it was a challenging but just incredibly rewarding and joyful sewing experience. So today I have 6 tips or lessons to share with you because I know I was very intimidated by the idea of trying to sew a wool coat, and I might not have done it if it weren't for the fact that that's what my daughter asked me to sew for her. So I'm hoping by sharing these tips or lessons learned that it will give you the confidence to dive in and try sewing a coat as well. So lesson number 1 is choose a pattern with great support and lots of reviews. So my daughter picked, thankfully for me, the Clare Coat by Closet Core Patterns. And this coat has an extensive sew along on the Closet Core website, and there are a lot of times that if it weren't for that sew along, I know I would have made a mistake in sewing it. It's not that the directions in the pattern aren't well written, they are, but just the fact that this was my first time sewing it, a wool coat like this, and I wasn't completely confident with how everything fit together. Having that sew along with the photographs and the additional information made a huge difference. There were also some YouTube videos that I found on it that were also helpful, but I really found this sew along was the most important thing. The other thing I did was I read every review of this coat on Pattern Review, and if you're not familiar with Pattern Review, I'll put a link to that down below. It is a free site. You can go on there and you can read about other people and what they have to say about the pattern. What is especially helpful about doing that is it gives you a heads up on any potential fitting issues. And by reading that, I did find out that a lot of people felt that the sleeve was too tight, and some people also had problems with fitting the raglan part of the sleeve. And it turned out I had problems with both of those things. So knowing that going into it was just a tremendous help. So my second tip is, in order to get a great fit on the coat, make a muslin, add a center back seam if there isn't one, and base fit the coat. So let me go through each of those. First of all, make a muslin. Now, that may seem obvious, but I wasn't going to do it. I really felt that a muslin would not, because the difference in weight between the wool coating and muslin fabric, that a muslin wouldn't really tell me much, and I was wrong about that. A muslin was extremely helpful. I decided to do one after listening to the Love to Sew podcast, where they highly recommend it, but then also having read those pattern reviews and knowing that people had trouble with the sleeve, I was like, okay, maybe we do need to do this. We were also planning, my daughter wanted me to interline the coat, and I'll talk about that in a further tip a little bit more, but that also made it questionable about what size I needed for her, because we wanted this coat to be especially warm, and she wanted to be able to wear a sweater under it, so making sure that we had the room to add an interlining and that it would fit over a sweater. Again, I was like, okay, I think we need to make that muslin. The second thing we did was add a center back seam. The reason for doing that is, if you noticed on the Clare Coat, it does have a raglan sleeve. I did find out from doing a little research that often a raglan design means that you need a little bit room across that center back. By having that center back seam, you can adjust it even after you've cut the coat out. So, and that goes to the second step, my third point here, which is baste fit the coat. So I cut, once we got the muslin and we were comfortable with the size I was making, I cut out the coat with that center back seam, which by the way, I gave a 1-inch seam allowance with that. So there was a lot to work with there. And then I took the whole coat and just baste fit it together. So I didn't add the zipper, I just basted the sleeves and the body of the coat together and then fit it on her again. And that's where I was able to, like, we just pulled it on like a smock to that center back, and I was able to then adjust it. And yes, I did end up giving her a little bit more room from that 1-inch seam allowance that I provided for on the center back seam. As I mentioned, we did have to do some adjustment in the sleeves. That's another thing to look for, is a coat that has both an underarm seam, a seam down here, but also a top seam. So whether you're making a raglan coat or one with a set-in sleeve, having a seam down here again lets you do more fitting and makes it more flexible. And again, that's where if you have just basted the actual pieces then together, you can take some of that seam allowance from both the bottom and the top if you need it to fit the coat better. As I mentioned, I did have to do some fitting of the raglan sleeve, and I have a blog post that shows exactly how I made that adjustment, so I will link to that post below. If you need to adjust a raglan sleeve, you can see what I did. So my third tip for you is interface the entire coat before you cut it out. So this one I learned from watching a YouTube video by Guthrie and Ganny, and she recommended this. So the Clare Coat comes with just a gazillion pattern pieces to for just interfacing. And especially because it's only available right now as a PDF pattern, to have cut all those pieces out and then cut out the interfacing and then attach them to the coat, it just is a huge time saver to just take your wool yardage, take your interfacing and interface it, and then proceed to cut out the coat. The second reason and advantage of doing that, which is maybe even more important than just the time saving on it, is if you've made any adjustments to the pattern pieces of the coat, you would then have to also adjust all your interfacing pieces. Well, I didn't have to do that. I could just make the adjustments to the base pattern pieces of the coat and then cut out my coat, and the interfacing was already handled. So that is a huge time and frustration saver. Okay, my fourth tip is to have the right notions. You don't need a lot, but there are a few that are really key. So the first one is a walking foot or dual feed. Now I have dual feed on my machine, so I just use that, but if you don't, having a walking foot is just so helpful to keep those thick, bulky layers of the wool from shifting as you're sewing it. The second thing is having some correct pressing tools. So first up is a pressing cloth. You don't want to end up with any shiny spots on your wool, and they can show up very easily. So this is just a piece of silk organza, but you could use a scrap piece of muslin, anything, but don't press directly on the wool. Then also, to get your seams nice and flat, is a wood clapper. And wool just responds so nicely to the steam. But then if you can press your seam, steam your seam using your pressing cloth, and then you use this, press down on it, the wood absorbs the steam and it just gives you a nice, really crisp finish. It makes those seams lie perfectly flat. It was tremendously helpful when I was doing the flap pockets on this coat. Also helpful is having a pressing ham. This really lets you get a nice finish on your raglan, and then a sleeve roll to really get those sleeve seams pressed open and flat. You can stick this right down your sleeve and get it to work really well. Couple other tools, binding clips. There just are some points where you have really thick layers of the wool and you just will bend a pin. So those binding clips to just hold it all together are so helpful. And then having an assortment of Microtex needle sizes. I sewed most of the coat with an 80, but there is some areas, especially along the zipper, where you're putting in the zipper flap. You're going through several layers, and then when you have the lining as well, and I needed to go all the way up to 110. So you don't get frustrated at 9 o'clock at night when you're trying to sew your coat, buy a variety of needle sizes. Okay, so lesson number 5. If you want a warm coat, interline it with Thinsulite. So an interlining is a layer between the wool coating and the lining fabric. And there's a lot of different things you can use for this. You can use flannel, you can use a thin layer of wool, you can, there is a product that is both interlining and lining in one, with a satin lining on one and the interlining fabric, it's all together. That makes it really easy if you want to use that. It's called Kasha in some places, K-A-S-H-A. You can also use a thin fleece. We chose to use Thinsulite. It adds probably the most warmth without a lot of bulk. It is a spun polyester product made by 3M, and you can purchase that from Vogue Fabrics, and I will give a link to it below. So the way you add the interlining layer is to use the lining fabric pieces to cut out the interlining, and then you sew the two of them together, the lining and the interlining, in the seam allowances, and you trim that interlining then down right to the edge of where you stitched it, because you're trying to eliminate the bulk that's in the seam itself. And then you treat that interlining and lining as one layer. It essentially is at that point. The challenge and the problem can come where you do not ever want 2 layers of Thinsulite, and so anywhere that would happen, and there are several spots with the lining where you have 2 layers of lining, you only want 1 of Thinsulite. So I have a separate video on how I handled the Thinsulite interlining, and I will link to that. It will be in one of the corners. I'm not sure which one I'm supposed to point to, but check out that video if you want to see how to apply the Thinsulite as an interlining. So my 6th tip for you is that quality wool coating is a joy to work with, and bagging a coat is fun. So on the blog post that I link below, I have a video clip separate of actually showing how I put the sleeves together and then bagged the coat. So if you're interested in seeing that, you can jump there and watch those few minutes of magic happening. If you have never given this fabric a try, I really encourage you to give it a try. The fabric that we used was a wool quilting that we purchased from Mood Fabrics. It was a double-faced wool, so it is that beautiful forest green on one side, and if you notice the navy blue contrasting collar, that navy blue is the wrong side of the fabric that I just used for the collar. So it just was magical to work with. I can't wait to work with a fabric like that again. Yes, it is expensive fabric, but my daughter ended up with a coat. I don't know where I would buy something with equal quality. It just is such beautiful fabric, and the coat ended up just being just a beautiful piece that she will have now for years. So if you've never given sewing a coat a try or sewing with wool coating, I hope you'll use these tips, dive in, overcome any hesitation you have, and really give it a try. It is so much fun. So until next time, if you haven't subscribed, please do so, and hit that notification bell again, and I will be back with more videos and more sewing adventures. So give yourself a challenge, give these tips a try, and sew yourself a winter coat.